So in this final recording, we shall now try to speak a little bit more about social disadvantage and how they really question these notions of choice versus equity, which we started speaking about in the previous recording. So as we flagged out earlier when discussing the article from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights around choice and equity, we saw how these are fundamental to education and education policy in particular. So many debates really about education are ongoing, and these are around the fundings, and they tend to revolve around, which of these aspirations between choice and equity should be prioritized in the way we make decisions regarding the education sector. So the idea of choice is quite interlinked. It's quite really linked to policies that enable parents to select alternative schools outside government provided options. So this idea is really originally, it originally emerged from Catholic parents' desire to send their children to Catholic schools instead of government schools, to always ensure that their children can receive faith-based education, as we started saying. So in today's Australian society, this is very much established. Parents now have this right to choose among government-run schools and Catholic schools or even independent schools of various religious denominations or even no religion at all for their children. But again, as we said, all these will be differently prioritized or viewed by different political parties. For example, the LNP generally tends to support the idea of choice. In their policy platforms, you'll see them tending to strongly support the fact that, parents have this choice and it should be, to some extent, really a free decision they really have to make about their children. So, and again, this is quite grounded in their liberal ideas, which emphasize individual freedoms, free markets, and diversity of options, which again speak to the political traditions we looked at in week 2. But on the other hand, equity in education policy frames free schooling for all citizens as a central government obligation and is really fundamental, foundational for a stronger economy through broader access to education. And again, parties such as the Greens and even Labour Party will typically tend to lean to this side of equity in education, which is quite well inspired by their socio-democratic ideals. So now the question becomes whether schools and education in particular can be considered through one of these angles of choice and equity, and even through the angle of private and public good, which we started speaking about in the previous recordings. And who gets to benefit most when choice is prioritized over equity? And how can we even achieve equity really in education? Because in the next few slides, the few considerations we shall be taking will be looking broadly onto this notion of social disadvantage and social disparities and how they get to affect access to education and even education achievement among different individuals and their backgrounds. So let's now unpack the notion of choice in education, which is often framed as empowering parents to select the best possible schools, what they consider to be the best schools for their children. So, advocates of market-based education often argue that competition creates diversity and drives improvement in education. But of course, this idea is now being challenged by Bonner and Shepard, who point out that mainstream schools in Australia are largely similar, despite the rhetoric of choice. Actually, yes, there are differences in the different schools, Catholic, government, and private schools, but these differences in the school structures are quite marginal and to some extent even minimal. So they also go on to argue that the marketization in which we are now mostly living has created winners and losers. Students who don't fit the dominant model, students with disability, those with trauma history, or students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, or even students who are in the racially or ethnically, minoritized groups are often marginalized to some extent and disadvantaged, not only in terms of how they access education, but also even in terms of school performance and academic achievement more broadly. So the school market may not be designed for these students to thrive. So the choice here becomes just a privilege, not a right. And this in itself really raises the question of whose choices are being honored and whose needs are being met or ignored in the way the education system operates. So again, this is really quite speaking to how social disadvantage keeps shaping different, circumstances around access to education, but also around educational outcome and even, academic achievement among students from different socioeconomic background and students from different identities and conditions. So, speaking about equity as well, there is also an ongoing problem of equity broadly in the education system. So while government funding flows to government, Catholic, and independent schools, as we said, actually inequality persists. And inequality really persists in the different ways students from different backgrounds access education, or even the different ways in which they get to, even differences in their educational outcomes. So this is clearly shown in the recent NAPLAN report, which really, again, highlights the trends on how Australia keeps being, one of the OECD countries where we see a lot of these disparities and inequalities based on students' background and students' socioeconomic conditions. So this data is just speaking to all these disparities and disadvantages. There is a whole heap of reasons why students from indigenous communities are still, to some extent, disadvantaged compared to non-indigenous students. Students from maybe refugee background will still be falling under the marginal side compared to non-refugee background students. And this data is really illustrating this, looking at the socioeconomic backgrounds of the parents, where students with a parent with a bachelor degree or higher keep outperforming those whose parents did not finish secondary school. And the higher, this gap is widened as students progress through schooling. And this is again illustrating how socioeconomic disadvantage keeps affecting education broadly. And all these other few graphs are speaking to the same notion of social disadvantage. How, for example, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are still disadvantaged, and disadvantage here, not only speaking about accessing education, but I'm also thinking of educational outcomes. Students who get to complete up to high school, students who end up dropping out from the school because of specific challenges they are experiencing, and all these other two graphs really are speaking to these broader issues. So, yeah, at this point now, you should really be able to identify the key actors and funding mechanisms in Australian education policy. Should also be able to explain how education functions as a human right, a social determinant of health, and a site of social protection. You should be able to critically assess the equity implication of the SRS model and funding disparities, and also recognize how political ideologies shape curriculum, governance, and public discourse. And you should be able to reflect on the intersections between education policy and broader social justice frameworks. Thank you very much, and see you in the tutorials.